the ratio was 9-1. Now if we turn narrowly to Gaza, Israel killed at least 158 civilians in Gaza in 2008 until December 26th, while 7 Israeli civilians were killed due to Palestinian rocket attacks from Gaza. And that does not include the period of the ceasefire when no Israelis were killed. So if we look strictly at Gaza, the ratio of killed was, in the year 2008, 20 Palestinian civilians were killed for each Israeli killed. Many of you know that Israel during this period loudly protested Hamas's detention of one Israeli soldier, the well-known Corporal Shalit, who was captured in June 2006. So the whole world knows Corporal Shalit's name. He's the one Israeli soldier who's being held by Hamas. On the other side of the ledger, Israel continues to imprison not one Palestinian, but 10,000 Palestinians, of whom 548 were held in administrative detention. That means no charges or trial. And 42 have been held for 2 years in administrative detention, no charges or trial. In addition, the broader picture of the occupied territories, according to B'Tselem, Israel tightened its sweeping restrictions on the freedom of movement of Palestinians in the West Bank. It expanded its illegal Jewish settlements, now housing nearly nearly a half million Israeli settlers in the occupied territories. It prevented any possibility of development and construction in Palestinian communities. It distributed water in a discriminatory manner. Although the Palestinian population in the West Bank is 9 times the settler population, its total water allocation, that Palestinian population, which is 9 times the settler population, its total water allocation is smaller than the settler water allocation. And Israel continued construction of a wall that will steal 12% of the West Bank, despite the International Court of Justice advisory opinion that the wall is illegal. Turning again narrowly to the Gaza, in January 2006, Hamas won Palestinian elections that were universally recognized as fair and free. Israel reacted to this fair and free election by tightening its economic blockade on Gaza. In June 2007, Hamas preempted a putsch organized by the US, Israel, and elements of the Palestinian Authority. After the abortive putsch, Israel further intensified its blockade of Gaza. In December 2008, right before the Gaza massacre, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, generally considered a reliable, authoritative organization, it published a study just on the eve of the Gaza massacre entitled "The Impact of the Blockade on the Gaza Strip, a Human Dignity Crisis." It reported that Israel's 18-month-long blockade, namely the period from June 2007 till December 2008, its 18-month blockade has created a profound human dignity crisis, leading to a widespread erosion of livelihoods and a significant deterioration in infrastructure and essential services. As a direct consequence of the Israeli blockade, according to OCHA, many Gaza residents were left without electricity for up to 16 hours each day and received water only once a week for a few hours. Nearly 50% of the Gaza population was left unemployed. More than 50% were left food insecure. 20% of essential drugs were at zero level in Gaza, and more than 20% of patients, 2,700, suffering from cancer, heart disease, and other severe conditions, were unable to get permits for medical care abroad. Many Palestinians, the OCHA study concludes, quote, reported a growing sense of being trapped physically, intellectually, emotionally, unquote. Well, if you look at the human rights record, it would seem the Palestinians had a much stronger case than Israel for resorting to armed force and self-defense. Be that as it may, let's now look at what actually happened. The early speculation on the real motive behind Israel's slaughter in Gaza, as I say, we can put aside for a moment and I'll go through it later. The ostensible motive to avert the rocket attacks obviously has no credibility. The speculation during the first couple of days of the massacre, it's centered on what were then the upcoming elections in Israel. And there's no question that there was some jockeying for votes going on among the main candidates, some of whom were held office, namely Mr. Barak and Zibi Livni. And there's no question in a Sparta-like society like Israel, consumed by revenge and a thirst for blood, killing Arabs is a sure crowd pleaser. And during the war, during the massacre, the polls showed that support for what was going on hovered in Israeli Jewish society, hovered at around 90%. But as the shrewd Israeli journalist covering the occupied territories, Gideon Levy, is the main journalist covering the occupied territories for Haaretz newspaper. He said in the early days of the war, I think in the second day of the massacre, he said that Israel went through a very similar war 2.5 years ago, namely the July-August 2006 war in Lebanon, when there were no elections. The point being, given the resemblance of these two wars, and in fact, as I'll try to show later, the two wars are intimately connected. Given the resemblance of these two wars, the elections couldn't have been the primary factor because the Lebanon war occurred right after elections. The Gaza massacre occurred right before, but the elections don't seem to be the main factor. And in fact, you can say about Israeli political elites that they tend to be very loyal to the state and loyal to the state interests. And they're not going to squander state interests for the sake of winning votes in an election if there's a major military operation about to ensue. That would be more narrow than the Israeli elites are prone to be, narrow in their focus. There have been cases in the past, most of you are much too young to remember, there are cases in the past where Israel did carry on military operations for the purposes of elections, but there were no major interests at stake. So, for example, there was this fellow who was prime minister in the early 1980s, a fellow named Menachem Begin, and in 1981 he was up for re-election and he bombed the Osirak reactor in Iraq. He claimed that it was making nuclear weapons, but that, of course, was complete mythology. Saddam Hussein was not then embarked on a nuclear weapons program. The reason he bombed the Osirak reactor was for electoral reasons and seems to have been fairly successful. But no major strategic interests were at stake for Israel at the time. I think that if you want to look at the fundamental motives behind the latest Israeli attack on Gaza, you have to look elsewhere. And the main motives, as I understand them, were first to first to restore what Israel calls its deterrence capacity, a term I'll explain or try to explain in a moment. And the second reason they attacked Gaza was because they had to turn back the latest Palestinian peace offensive. The Palestinians were becoming too reasonable, in this case Hamas. They were becoming too reasonable. They were